Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching me on YouTube and on Rumble, and I apologize for the technical problem. The software decided that the countdown must be stopped there, where they were still 1.5 minutes. But here we go, live on Syriana Analysis. Let me know, guys, if you can hear me sound and well. I'm just changing some of the settings of this machines that I have here. And I hope you are all doing well. And if you're following me, guys, on Facebook, Twitter, X, or Telegram, I already made an announcement that on Thursday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, which is 12 noon time in Eastern American time, one of the guests that you were asking for the past few weeks, Alistair Crook, he's going to be my guest on Syriana Analysis. And there is a story behind Alistair. I met him the first time, actually, this was in 2012 in Beirut. He had a center, research center there, and I applied for a job there. And I still remember that I met his wife back then. And they are really beautiful people. I really respect them, and I also respect their political positions, stances, and what they're doing nowadays. It's a great service because he's putting his expertise and his knowledge for the public service and for the people to understand what's happening around the world, especially that Alistair was a senior British diplomat and also a former MI6 agent. So we're, of course, going to discuss the Ukraine war, the French rhetorical escalation against Russia. We're going to discuss, of course, Gaza. So, guys, if you have any questions, this video is an opportunity for you to post your questions in the comments below, not in the live chat, because it's difficult for me later to see the live chat when this live streaming is over. Please post your comments when this live streaming is over about the current geopolitical conflicts in the Eurasian region. We're talking about Russia, the United States, NATO, Taiwan, in the Middle East, for example, Gaza, and also Syria. And he's very knowledgeable about these cases. Today's live streaming is going to be about the recent interview of Jeffrey Sachs with the Piers Morgan. Sometimes I even forget his name. I mean, this video is not made to disrespect Piers Morgan, and I also would kindly ask you, if you have any criticism for Piers Morgan, make it respectful. We are here to discuss the ideas raised during this interview and not to attack anyone, whether Piers Morgan or Jeffrey Sachs. The first time I came across Jeffrey Sachs was in 2015, when I was doing a research about Syria, and I found a video of him on MSNBC talking about how the CIA is waging covert operations inside Syria. And he even named the name of the program of the CIA called Timber Sycamore. And I was like, what is this? Like, even myself as a Syrian, I didn't know that the CIA had its own secret covert operation inside Syria called Timber Sycamore, and how they were funneling the money and training. We all knew that they are doing these activities in Syria, but we didn't know that it has a name, it has a program, and they're spending $1 billion per year to remove Assad from power. And I started to dig in since then. And I don't know if I am allowed to call myself an expert on Syria, but since then I've been digging in more and more into the rabbit hole to understand more what happened inside my country, and also to draw parallels with other conflicts in order to avoid similar scenarios in other parts of the world. Because in my opinion, the job of the journalist is to critically analyze what's happening around the world and to try to prevent similar scenarios from happening, especially, for example, what happened in Syria or what happened in Ukraine. And why I'm doing this video, because Jeffrey Sachs actually raised like big allegations, right? He said things that are very controversial, probably for the mainstream people, those who watch TVs and watch MSNBC or watch CNN or watch Fox News or German mainstream media or British mainstream. Most of the mainstream media around the world, they peddle different narratives than what Jeffrey Sachs raised during this interview. And notice something during this interview. Piers Morgan never pushed against the ideas made by Jeffrey Sachs about Ukraine. He didn't say that you're incorrect. He didn't say that you're making false allegations. However, he wanted to divert the conversation and take it into a different direction. He wanted for the discussion to be more about Putin himself and how evil Putin is and how dictator Putin is and how mafiosi Putin is and how he kills his opponents and how this and that. So the reason for that is I'm going to explain to you again in this live streaming. This is a well-studied tactic by the mainstream media. They want you as a guest when you go to their TV channels. When they don't agree with your opinion, they divert the conversation. They change the conversation into a path that you are now here to defend yourself. For example, in the case of the Gaza Strip, do you condemn Hamas? And in the case of Ukraine, they want you to speak about Putin and not about the root causes of this war or the actions and the reactions of both sides. Like one side is evil and unrealistic, irrational, and the other side is rational and has good will toward Russia, but those evil Russians are doing this and that, right? So this is the context of today's live streaming. I'm very excited about it because I've been taking notes of most of the important ideas that he raised during this interview, and I wanted to fact check if Jeffrey Sachs made actually correct points or correct ideas. So we're going to verify them in this live streaming. And spoiler alert, most of the points that he made about Ukraine, Russia were accurate. So let's screen this video of Jeffrey Sachs with Piers Morgan. I have already divided them into different time codes so that we can discuss together what he said in this interview.
What is your view of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think he's very smart, very tough. And I think he says what he means. In 2007, he said, don't do this at the Munich Security Conference, famously. He said, all right, you went violating what I know to be true, by the way, which was not an inch eastward for NATO, promised by James Baker III and by Hans-Dietrich Genscher to Gorbachev in 1990. I know that's for sure the case. The United States expanded NATO to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic in the Clinton period, and then to 7 more countries in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And then in 2007, Putin said, stop. All right, stop. No more, not to Ukraine. So what does George W. do in 2008 in Bucharest? Of course, what does he do? He says, guarantee Ukraine and Georgia. And, this is Palmerston's playbook from 1853. So we're going to surround Russia in the Black Sea again. Exactly that.
Okay.
So he interrupts him here, and I will just stop screening this now. So the first point that he made, that there was a promise made for Russia that NATO will not move 1 inch towards the east of Berlin. This is very controversial nowadays among the mainstream pundits because they reject the notion that there were any promise made. I mean, there is something called international law gentleman agreement, and there is something when you promise something to someone. This is called a gentleman agreement. I mean, this was the mistake of Gorbachev back then, not to take these words and register it in the UN Security Council, for example, as a binding agreement. But this was a promise made by the Secretary of State of the United States, which represents the foreign policies of the US back then in 1990, right? So the promise was made by Gorbachev. And this is, I'm going to show you this secret document, which later were, of course, published to the public. So entire screen. I think I should make it like this or like this. Yes. So this is the document that was classified back then, and then they unclassified it. So the date of this memorandum of conversation between Secretary of State James Baker, President Gorbachev, and Edward Shevardnadze. he is the Polish, I believe, prime minister or foreign minister back then. So this is going. The date of this conversation goes back to the 9th of February 1990, right? And if we scroll down and we see what they have spoken about Germany, for example, and when it comes to the NATO enlargement, okay, so here is Becker is speaking, right? He says, I have got one or two other points. We don't favorably view a neutral Germany. The FRG says that this is not satisfactory approach. A neutral Germany, in our view, is not necessarily going to be a non-militaristic Germany. It could well decide that it needed its own independent nuclear capability as opposed to depending on the deterrent of the United States. All our allies and East Europeans we have spoken to have told us that they want us to maintain a presence in Europe. I'm not sure whether you favor that or not, he's asking here Gorbachev, but let me say that if our allies want us to go, we will be gone in a minute. Indeed, if they want us to leave, we will go, and I can assure you that the sentiment of the American people is such that they will want us to leave immediately. The mechanism by which we have a US military presence in Europe is NATO. If you abolish NATO, there will be no more US presence. I mean, from the conversation, I get the sense that he is talking to Gorbachev as a friend and not as an enemy here. We understand the need for assurances, he says, to the countries in the East. If we maintain a presence in Germany that is a part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the East. Again, we understand the need for assurances, he means to the Soviet Union, and also to the countries in the East. If we maintain a presence in a Germany that is a part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the East. At the end of the day, if it is acceptable to everyone, we could have discussions in a 2+4 context that might achieve this kind of an outcome. Maybe there is a better way to deal with the external consequences of German unification. And if there is, I am not aware of it, we don't have German agreement, but we have mentioned it to the Genscher, and he said he wants to think about it. Dumas liked it, and now I have mentioned it to you. So this is what James Baker, the Secretary of State of the United States, told to Gorbachev, that he understands that there are concerns from Eastern European allies and also by the Soviet Union and the presence of NATO there. And he says that when our European allies want us to leave, then we will immediately leave these countries. And since then, NATO was expanding, whether this was against the promise or not. I mean, of course, it was against the promise, but whether with the acceptance of the Eastern European countries or not, because as I told you guys, it's easier nowadays to persuade these countries to join NATO. And it's easier to install puppet governments in these countries. For example, one of them is now, unfortunately, in Yerevan, in Armenia. And today, the secretary, what's the name of Stoltenberg? He was in Yerevan, and Armenia is turning itself into another pawn country because they are able to persuade the people, and I don't want to use the term brainwash, but I want to say indoctrinate the people, right? They are very capable through their political, through their financial, and through their also journalistic and media tools to persuade the people to change their electoral choices. And this is what happened in Armenia in 2018, and they brought Pashinyan to power, and up until this moment, Pashinyan is redirecting the strategic security alliances of Yerevan or Armenia from the CSTO to NATO. And Armenia is going to be the next victim in this region. Unfortunately speaking, I have been warning this since 2018. I'm really sick and tired about this because I'm ethnic Armenian, and I know very well that Armenia will pay a heavy price for this directing its security or changing its security architecture and trusting NATO, France, the United States, etc. Now, he also made a few other points here, and I want to just go through the points of Jeffrey Sachs, one of which is the NATO enlargement. Yes, so there was a promise that NATO will not enlarge to the east of Berlin, but they did. So what were the countries that NATO enlarged too. So I just want to show you this map, and this is the chart. Correct. So this is the chart. This is a new article. They say Sweden to join NATO after approval from Hungary. So first of all, we had the Clinton era. And in the Clinton era, we had Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joining NATO. And this is during the in the 90s, right? To 1999. And then under George Bush jurisdiction, we had Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria. So they reached all the way to the borders with Russia, and the only country that was left on the borders with Russia in Eastern Europe, we're not talking about the Baltic countries now, was Ukraine. And then we had also promise from George Bush in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia both will eventually join NATO, and there is an open door policy for these countries to join NATO. But before 2008, Putin was in let me just remove this. So Putin went himself to the Munich Security Conference. And this is an annual meeting, an annual conference that was already held a few weeks ago when this Navalny guy was, he died, and his wife or the widow was already there. It turned from a serious security meeting into receiving and listening to the opinion, geopolitical opinion of the wife or the widow of Navalny. Unfortunately, I mean, the entire political discussion in the West has become too low. You know, the level is too low. The bar of the intellectual discussion has become too low when it comes to really serious geopolitical issues. But in 2007, before George Bush made this promise and said that Georgia and Ukraine will eventually join NATO and there is an open door policy, Putin went to Munich and he spoke to his European partners and he warned them that this is going to provoke Russia. So this is the video. It's 3.5 minutes video from 2007. Listen to what Putin said and his warning to NATO and to the European countries.
Нас также не могут не тревожить планы по развертыванию элементов системы противоракетной обороны в Европе. Кому нужен очередной виток неизбежной в этом случае гонки вооружений? Глубоко сомневаюсь, что самим европейцам. Ракетного оружия, реально угрожающего Европе, с дальностью действия порядка 5-8 тысяч километров нет ни у одной так называемой из проблемных стран. И в обозримом будущем, в обозримой перспективе и не появится, не предвидится даже. Да и гипотетический пуск, например, северокорейской ракеты по территории США через Западную Европу, это явно противоречит законам баллистики. Как говорят у нас в России, это все равно, что правой рукой дотягиваться до левого уха. И находясь здесь, в Германии, не могу не упомянуть и о кризисном состоянии договора об обычных вооруженных силах в Европе. Адаптированный договор об обычных вооруженных силах в Европе был подписан в 1999 году. Он учитывал новую геополитическую реальность, ликвидацию Варшавского блока. С тех пор прошло 7 лет. И только 4 государства ратифицировали этот документ, включая Российскую Федерацию. Страны НАТО открыто заявили, что не ратифицируют договор, включая положение о фланговых ограничениях, о размещении на флангах определенного количества вооруженных сил, до тех пор, пока Россия не выведет свои базы из Грузии и Молдавии. Из Грузии наши войска выводятся, причем даже в ускоренном порядке. Эти проблемы мы с нашими грузинскими коллегами решили, и это всем известно. В Молдавии остается группировка в 1500 военнослужащих, которые выполняют миротворческие функции и охраняют склады с боеприпасами, оставшиеся со времен СССР. И мы с господином Соланой обсуждаем постоянно этот вопрос. Он знает нашу позицию, мы готовы и дальше работать по этому направлению. Но что же происходит в это же самое время? А в это самое время в Болгарии и Румынии появляются так называемые легкие американские передовые базы по 5000 штыков в каждой. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. А мы, строго выполняя договор, никак не реагируем на эти действия. Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса или к обеспечению безопасности в Европе. Наоборот, это серьезно провоцирующий фактор, снижающий уровень взаимного доверия. И у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение. И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора? Где теперь эти заявления? О них даже...
So this is the segment that I wanted to show you from the statement of Putin during the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And he mentioned a few things here. The first one was there are missile systems that the United States is installing in Eastern Europe. And he said those are not directed against North Korea, because North Korea is not going to fire against the United States from over Europe. I mean, he says that there is a Russian saying that you don't catch your left ear with your right hand, right? And the second thing he mentioned, the deployment of the US troops under the flags of NATO in these countries, 5,000, 5,000, and 5,000 soldiers in different countries on the borders with Russia. And the third one was the NATO enlargement. He said that these three developments in Europe are not about the what they say, it's about NATO enlargement and not about the modernization of the NATO alliance, right? And he said he knows that against who this enlargement and these developments are directed. You cannot fool us, right? You cannot come and say those are against North Korea. We know that those are against us. And similarly, a few years ago, Putin was asked about this same question, that those missile systems of the United States in Eastern Europe are actually defensive missiles. They are directed at Iran's threats against Europe. And he started laughing. There is this meme, if you want to write Putin laughs, and you can see the picture of him or the meme of him laughing when the journalist asks him, and he says, but this is directed against Iran and not against Russia. And he says, you made me laugh. Now I can go to bed with a smiley face, after a very long, hard work day. And here comes why I'm making this video, because I think that this war could have been avoided, right? If the Russian concerns were taken into consideration, and also the words of Putin were taken seriously, because remember what Jeffrey Sachs said. He said that Putin is a tough person, and also he does what he says. And he has been warning the West for quite some time that he is not going to tolerate the expansion of NATO to Ukraine. And unfortunately speaking, in 2008, because we mentioned that George Bush actually promised the entry of Ukraine, and this is 15 years ago, guys, and this is from The Guardian. I just want to see. Yes, it's on April the 1st, 2008. Bush backs Ukraine and Georgia for NATO membership. George Bush this morning said he strongly supported Ukraine's attempt to join NATO and warned he would not allow Russia to veto its membership bid. This is from April 1st, 2008. Speaking in Kiev, look how they used to write Kiev as Kiev and not Kyiv. After a meeting with Ukraine's President Viktor Yushchenko, the US President said both post-Soviet Ukraine and Georgia should be allowed to join the alliance, despite vehement objections from Russia. In remarks likely to infuriate the Kremlin, Bush said Ukraine should be invited during this week's NATO summit in Bucharest to join NATO's membership action program, a prelude to full membership. He also said that there could be no deal with Moscow over the US administration's contentious plans to locate elements of its controversial missile defense systems in Eastern Europe. Look how they used even to call it a controversial back then. The media was a little bit more honest back then, right? About these cases. Nowadays, if you go to Guardian, they completely sell out, unfortunately, and they are ridiculing the warnings of Putin that previously they said those are controversial steps taken by the United States. But Jeffrey Sachs also mentioned something called Palmerston's playbook. If you remember in this, he said this is from the Palmerston's playbook against Russia. They want to isolate Russia in the Black Sea. I didn't know what's Palmerston's playbook. So when I checked in, I found out that this is coming from the Great Crimean War between 1854 and 1856. This was a war fought by an alliance of Britain, France, Turkey, and Sardinia against Russia. It was the only major European conflict the army engaged in between 1816 and 1914. For the British, the campaign was symbolized by military and logistical incompetence alongside the bravery and endurance of its soldiers. All these articles are, of course, pro-British, but I just wanted to see the outcome of this war. So the outcome of this war was with a peace treaty, and the Russians were shaken by the loss of Sevastopol. In October 1855, their mainland base of Kinburn also fell to the Allies. When the Austrians threatened to enter the war against them, the Russians agreed to peace terms, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in March 1856. One of the treaty's clauses was the neutralization of the Black Sea and Dardanelles. This served as a blow to the Russian dream of a warm water naval port in the south. So if you see the map of the war here in the article, excuse me, here, yeah. So the entire Black Sea here was neutralized, and there were no more Russian fleet here and no more access of Russia to the warm waters. And please remember, guys, that Black Sea can also give access to Russia to go through the Constantinople to the Mediterranean. So one of the things that after 2014 that Russia did, if you remember when the coup happened, they directly and very quickly secured the Crimean Peninsula because they know that they have a big fleet there and they want to secure their geopolitical position on the Black Sea in order to not to be isolated from the warm waters. This was the goal. The main goal of the coup is to kick the Russians out of the Crimean, so they occupied it and they hold a referendum there and they annexed it after a referendum, and now Crimea is part of the Russian Federation. So those are the points that were made by Jeffrey Sachs in the first segment of this video. The James Baker promise was correct. He promised to Gorbachev not to enlarge NATO 1 inch to the east of Berlin. The NATO enlargement was under Clinton to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and then under the Bush administration, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria, and he also promised for Ukraine and Georgia a membership. And then we also watched what Putin said in 2007 when he warned that this is the line and please don't enlarge more toward our borders, and we consider this as a hostile act. Unfortunately, these warnings were not, they were absolutely ridiculed. So let's continue what Jeffrey Sachs said now in the rest of this interview.
Okay, but I don't interrupt, but just to interrupt though, I just asked you what your view of Putin is, and so far you've just said he's smart and tough.
I told you he warned us very
negatives?
clearly.
Any negatives, Professor?
I believe that the big mistake of both sides is we should talk this out. And now let me say a word about talking it out. In 2008, when Bucharest happened, European leaders called me because I'm friends with them. They said, "What is your crazy president doing?" By the way, some who are in power right now, I won't name names. What is your president doing? Why is he destabilizing things? He promised he wasn't going to push Ukraine. That's what European leaders say in private. They don't say it in public. We avoided the negotiations. Then 2014 came. Sadly, Piers, I saw it. I saw some of it firsthand. It was ugly. The United States should not be funding overthrows of governments. We did. I know it. Okay. So I happened to be there soon afterwards with the handpicked government, handpicked by Victoria Nuland. We didn't talk then. Then came the Minsk agreements. And then the United States said, privately, even though the UN Security Council has backed both Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. You don't have to do this. And so with Poroshenko, don't worry about it. Then we heard, of course, Chancellor Merkel say afterwards, yeah, we weren't taking it too seriously, even though Germany and France were the guarantors of that. Then on December 15th, 2021, Putin put it down in a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. I read it. I called the White House. I said, you know what? You can negotiate on this basis. Avoid the war. No, there's going to be no war, Mr. Sachs. I said, just tell them that NATO is not going to enlarge. You'll avoid the war. No, we're never going to say that. We have an open door policy. So what kind of open door policy? We've had 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine, some open door policy. No, Mr. Sachs. Then the war breaks out. Then immediately Zelensky says, okay, we can be neutral. We can be neutral. And negotiations start. As you know, Naftali Bennett, informally the prime minister of Israel, and Turkey with its very skilled diplomacy. I actually flew to Ankara to discuss with the Turkish diplomats what was going on. The U.S. stopped the agreement. Why? Because they thought we'll win. We can bleed Russia. Our sanctions, cutting them out of the banking system, we're going to bring them to their knees. It's a bunch of terrible miscalculations is what it is.
Okay.
It's a game.
So do you realize, guys, that Piers Morgan, yes, he allows him, I give credit to him, that he allows him to tell his mind, but he doesn't push against the ideas made by Jeffrey Sachs. He wants to personalize the discussion about Putin. Now, Jeffrey Sachs made really, big allegations here, right? Again, first of all, we funded the coup in Ukraine. This is a very, very long discussion. It could go for hours now in order to show you how the United States actually funded and encouraged the coup in Ukraine and also executed it. But if you want to know really more about this, you should watch the documentary Ukraine on Fire for Oliver Stone. You can find it on Rumble. YouTube deleted it, which means there is something important in this documentary that YouTube doesn't want you to watch. Go on Rumble or any other platforms like Odessa or I don't know what are the other alternatives, and just Google or search for Ukraine on Fire, Oliver Stone, and watch this documentary and see how the United States orchestrated the coup in Ukraine. Now, the coup happened, but the European countries, especially France and Germany, and also Russia, they came together and they struck a deal called Minsk Agreement. There was a Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2, but those agreements were violated by Ukraine they kept shelling the Donbas region and Donetsk especially and Lugansk, and they have killed over 13,000 of the Russian-speaking people there. They banned the Russian language and they started persecuting the people on their religious beliefs, etc., etc. And most of this persecution started to happen from the far-right, ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, right? But we know now in 2024 that the Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2, that the guarantors were Germany and France, they themselves knew that they want to strike this deal in order to buy time for Ukraine to get ready for war with Russia. And we know this because Angela Merkel, she confessed actually that this was the case. And this was in December 2022. So Putin said Russia may have to make Ukraine deal one day, but partners cheated in the past. So how did they cheat in the past? Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia would likely have to reach agreements regarding Ukraine in the future, but felt betrayed by the breakdown of the Minsk agreements. Putin said Germany and France, which brokered ceasefire agreements in the Belarusian capital Minsk between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, had betrayed Russia and were now pumping Ukraine with weapons. In an interview published in Germany's Zeit magazine on Wednesday, this is in December 2022, by the way. So how many months? Around 8 months after the Russian offensive against Ukraine, or 10 months. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that the Minsk agreements had been an attempt to, quote, give Ukraine time to build up its defenses. Speaking on Friday at a news conference in Kyrgyzstan, Putin said he was disappointed by Merkel's comments. And this is not the only she's not the only one who confessed this, but also the former president of France, François Hollande, who was tricked by some Russian pranksters. And they actually made a phone call with him or a video Zoom call or whatever, acting like they are, I think, former Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko. So they were like pretending to be like the former president of Ukraine. And they tricked him and they asked him about the Minsk agreement. And this is what he said in this regard. Check.
François Hollande, the former French president, has been duped by pro-Kremlin pranksters Vivan and Alexis, who posed as the former Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko. The interview lasted about 15 minutes and was recorded back in February, but it was only released a few days ago on social media. At one point, the Russian duo starts asking questions about the Minsk agreements, and this is what the former French president had to say.
Il y avait l'idée que c'était Poutine qui avait voulu gagner du temps. Non. C'est nous qui voulions gagner du temps pour permettre à l'Ukraine de se rétablir, de renforcer ses moyens militaires. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut défendre la négociation de Minsk, dans laquelle tu as joué un rôle très important. Il faut la défendre parce que c'est précisément pendant ces 7 ans qu'il y a eu pour l'Ukraine des moyens de se renforcer. Et c'est là que Poutine s'est trompé, c'est qu'il a sous-estimer la capacité des Ukrainiens et leur résistance.
Many Twitter.
So this is so the statements are Merkel and François Hollande, the former leaders of France and Germany, were clear in this regard that they perceived this agreement as an opportunity to buy time in order to equip Ukraine with the weapons and the ammunition they need and the training in order to recapture the Donbas region that the pro-Russian separatists have occupied after the coup in 2014. And the Russians also occupied the Crimean Peninsula. So they wanted to completely kick out the Russians from the Crimean, and so in order to, as I mentioned, to control the Black Sea completely, so the Russians would not have any access to the warm waters, and secondly, in order to defeat the separatists in the east and subjugate the Russian-speaking and the ethnic Russians there by these ultra-nationalist groups. This is what happened, unfortunately, in Ukraine under the guise of the European Union and under the guise of NATO. So we see now that the NATO countries have actually helped orchestrate the coup, especially the United States under the leadership of Victoria Nuland in Ukraine. Secondly, the Minsk agreements were agreed upon, were violated by Ukraine and also encouraged by the United States to violate these agreements because they saw it as an opportunity for Ukraine to buy time. This was by the confession of François Hollande and Angela Merkel. Now, he also mentioned on Piers Morgan's show, Jeffrey Sachs mentioned that the United States actually received 2 documents from Russia. This was a proposal from Russia for a new security agreement between the United States or NATO and Russia in order to avoid the war in Ukraine. And the Biden administration received this document in December 2021. So actually around 2-3 months before the Russian invasion or the Russian offensive against Ukraine. And they said that they want to negotiate about this. In my opinion, if I'm the American side or the Russian side, the Russians, of course, they have the right to give a proposal or submit a proposal and make the bar of the demands high, right? When you go to negotiation, you always come with the higher demands. And then that's why diplomacy exists, because both sides start to negotiate. One side makes some concessions, the other side makes some concessions, compromises, etc., etc. And then they agree on some middle ground, right? So this was the proposal of Russia to the United States and to NATO countries before the invasion of the offensive of Russia against Ukraine. Russia makes sweeping demands for security guarantees from US amid Ukraine tensions. And this is in December 17th, 2021, as I mentioned, just 2-3 months before the war erupted in Ukraine. So now you see the language of the ABC News. They make it like it's a very radical proposal from Russia and it's unacceptable. Russia published a list of sweeping new security guarantees it wants from the United States and NATO on Friday, including a promise not to expand the alliance, staking out demands for de-escalating the crisis it has stoked around Ukraine. The radical proposal, so they call it a radical proposal, would rewrite the post-Cold War security order in Europe, obliging the US and NATO to commit to not admitting any new members, including Ukraine, but also effectively prohibiting any NATO military activity in Eastern Europe and most of the former Soviet Union. This is the missile systems that Putin spoke about in 2007. The demands were presented in two draft treaties that Russia's foreign ministry published on Friday, with Russia saying it had passed them to the Biden administration earlier this week. But the US and NATO countries have already previously ruled out Russian demands for a veto on the alliance's expansion, and on Friday, a senior Biden administration official immediately rejected the two key Russian proposals to bar Ukraine from ever joining or NATO expanding farther eastwards. We will not compromise on key principles on which European security is built, the administration official told reporters, speaking on the condition of anonymity. They were very quick to reject it, right? They didn't have any intention to negotiate about it. I think it would have been a good to start negotiating with the Russians and see if you can probably get a middle ground agreement with the Russians, right? They say here all countries have the right to decide their own future and their own foreign policy, free from outside interference, and that goes for Ukraine, and it also goes for NATO allies and the alliance itself. I mean, theoretically, this is correct. You have the right to have your own independent foreign policy and own your security policies, but you don't have the right, in my opinion, to install missile systems on your territory directed at my country. If I'm the leader of country X and the neighboring country is installing missiles from a third country, and in this case the United States, and those missiles are directed against me, I don't consider that as an independent decision to install American missiles on the territory and threaten my national security. You have the right to defend yourself, but you don't have the right to threaten me, right? I think this is a point that is missing always during the discussion, and it's like something very extraordinary to say, right? Like now, imagine Russia creates a new alliance. Let's call it RASO, right? RASO, a new alliance like NATO, RASO. And they invite Cuba and they invite some Latin American countries to join this security alliance. But the condition is if you join this alliance, then I have to install my troops in your country. Secondly, I will also install my missile systems in your country, and these missiles will be directed at Washington, D.C., and against the Pentagon, against the CIA, against the State Department, and you have no right to object that as the United States, right? It sounds so ridiculous, right? So, in my opinion, all these discussions about Ukraine is so amateurish and so... people do not really want to understand the root causes of these wars. And they interpret this as like a Putin talking point. It's not a Putin talking point to point out that if you install your missile and direct it against me, I will consider that a threat against myself, right? There are people in Russia they criticize Putin and they say he was too late to invade Ukraine. And he gave the West the benefit of the doubt, and he waited so many years to wage this military operation. I don't endorse military operation of Russia. I'm not a Russian. I'm just here explaining what I think is in the head of Putin when it comes to the geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, based on my knowledge and my understanding, the information, and when I put the geography in front of me, the maps, and I see why he invaded Ukraine, okay, I understand that. This is why I want to share this information with you. Now, another information that Jeffrey Sachs again mentioned, that they were very close to striking a deal. And we know this, everybody knows this is true. And this is the former Israeli Prime Minister said, the West interrupted Russia-Ukraine peace talks. And he said this, what's the date of this article? In February 2023. right? So 1 year after the Russia-Ukraine war, he confessed that there were negotiations, and he said, Naftali Bennett revealed to Israeli media that he traveled to Moscow as Israeli Prime Minister last March to broker an early ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and the two sides agreed to make compromises, but the ceasefire talks were, quote, interrupted by the West. Bennett said that during his mediation, Zelensky promised not to join NATO, and Putin dropped his main goals of special military operations, seeking disarmament and denazification of Ukraine. So Putin actually agreed to even drop the disarmament of Ukraine, or what they call the denazification, if Ukraine declares that they will be neutral and they will not join NATO. Adding in his impression, both Russia and Ukraine want a ceasefire and have drawn about 17 or 18 ceasefire drafts, but at some point the West decided to crush Putin rather than to negotiate. The former Israeli Prime Minister also said that all of his actions had been agreed in detail with the US, Germany, and France. He says, quote, they interrupted the talks. In April 2022, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the Russian-Ukrainian talks that were proceeding quite successfully in Istanbul were broken down on the direct order from the US and London, which totally controlled Zelensky, who had evidently received an order from the Washington patrons to frustrate the negotiations. This is a very unfortunate truth. This is why I say, if you join NATO, or if you become a de facto member of NATO, such as the case nowadays with Ukraine, if you put all your eggs in the basket of NATO, if you bet that, or put all your biddings on NATO, then the NATO will have a control over you, and they will have an influence over you, and they actually sabotage the peace talks, although Zelensky wanted at the beginning for this peace process to proceed, and this would have been the best solution for Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and tens of thousands of Russians would have been alive now. The Ukrainian cities would not have been destroyed. Crimea and the Donbass would have been kept its special status, but under Ukrainian jurisdiction. And the Ukrainians and Russians would have lived side by side peacefully, right? I deeply believe this was the case, and they completely sabotage these peace talks to cause this war and to continue this war further. So, why has Putin tolerated, the expansion of other countries, for example, or the accession of other countries into NATO? There was Russians were accepting the accession of Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and then Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria, etc., etc. But when it came to Ukraine, this was the red line for them, right? And I think the reason is, I will explain to you guys, I think in my geopolitical understanding of Europe, Europe has three bridges. And the first bridge, the bridge starts in France, then goes to Germany. Four bridges, sorry. France, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. And the United States already has an access in France, in Germany, in Poland, and they wanted Ukraine. If they have this continuity of US hegemonic status in these countries, the United States will be able to project its power into Russia itself, inside the Russian Federation, and they will be able to destabilize Russia from within. And this is something, not a conspiracy theory, even the people who hate Russia, and they say that they want this to happen. And this is something that was going on in the minds of the geopolitical experts or the geopolitical planners in the United States. So this is a map published by this woman. She's a Dutch European activist journalist, whatever, Mariska den Elden. She says that not only Putin must go, but the Kremlin itself must go. Breaking up Russia is the only way to end its imperialism. And she publishes this map and how the Russian Federation must be divided into different sub-states, right? And I think this is the ultimate goal of NATO. And I said, this is Washington's master plan. Once Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, the US can project its hegemonic power into Russia and lay the ground for potential disintegration. Now you understand the reason, I should have said one of the reasons behind Russia's attack on Ukraine. The Russians understand this. They know the master plan of the United States. Now, when you watch this interview of Piers Morgan with Jeffrey Sachs, you see that he always trying to ask him about Putin, right? I mentioned this a few times. And I think this is the media tactic. This is deliberate media tactic to distract the audience and also to divert the conversation from important points when Jeffrey Sachs wants to answer and say and give his opinion about the root causes of the problem. He stops him and, let's talk about Putin. Say something bad about Putin, something negative about Putin. This is a deliberate attempt to distract the audience and not to give them informed information about what's happening in Ukraine. And I was reading a new post by Bassem Youssef. I think most of you know Bassem Youssef, guys. He's a famous Egyptian comedian. And he wrote this post in Arabic, actually, but there is an auto translation and I summarized some of his points. And he made a brilliant point about his experience with the Western mainstream media. And this is the exact same tactic that Piers Morgan used against Jeffrey Sachs. And this was the same exact tactic that were also employed by similar journalists and also by Piers Morgan himself against Bassem Youssef. He said, I want to share with you my experience of appearing in foreign programs over the past period and about things that we should keep in mind when we discuss what is happening now in Gaza. Most discussions try to bore you at some point in order to avoid the real issue. They drag you into side discussions about whether Hamas is a terrorist or not. See what Muslims do it to each other. Why don't you talk about Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and Syria? What did Hamas do to Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, and is it corrupt or not good? Unfortunately, as Arabs, we are drawn into these discussions and you find that time is wasted because you are placed in a defensive position and the public no longer has the opportunity to discuss the daily Israeli crimes under Israeli lobbyist control over the course of American politics. If you watch my conversations, you will see that I try to get out of these side discussions and focus on one thing: Israel, Israel, Israel. Unfortunately, many Arab discussions or Arab debaters, he wants to say this is just auto-translation, fall into this trap. We find ourselves going in circles. The only goal is that we prefer to need other things and waste time on questions such as, do you condemn Hamas? Israel has no right to defend itself. Why do Arabs not scratch refugees or take refugees? A speech intended to waste the interview's time with idle talk. I remain in the dialogue for one only goal, which is to expose Israeli propaganda and the lies spread by the media. Look at any Israeli official when he appears in the media. Any accusations made against him, it appears that he is turning the dialogue against the Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims in general, so that he prefers to direct the dialogue in the way they want. Last week, I appeared on Lex Fridman, one of the most listened and viewed podcasts. The conversation was 3 hours long, and it will come out after 2 days. Arm yourself with knowledge, arm yourself with facts instead of what we prefer to confuse ourselves with and blow ourselves up on our own. Within the next 2 weeks, he's going to be on CNN, BBC, blah, blah, blah. So, there are two things here that I want to mention. One, this tactic is deliberate from this journalist in order to put you in a defensive position. But see what Jeffrey Sachs said. He's like, oh, you have your questions, I have my answers, right? And this is the same thing that Bassem Youssef is advocating for. And I truly think that this is the correct approach. Whatever they ask you, you own your answers. If you're invited to a show, and they ask you something, do you condemn Hamas? What do you think about Putin? Is he not evil? Is he not bad? Is he not gangster? Etc., etc. You own your questions, I own my answers. I say what I want to say. And I do this most of the time. I mean, even when I go to what they call the friendly channels like Russia Today, I mean, they're not trying to corner me or embarrass me with some questions, but I listen to the question, but I own the answer because I have also an agenda. When I go to TV, I want to deliver a message or I want to say something that I want to say, right? So I think this is a good approach, especially when you are with a hostile journalist or a journalist trying to change the subject, etc., etc. This is the perfect formula. But since Bassem Youssef mentioned Lex Fridman, Guys, I truly don't know if Lex Fridman is boosted by YouTube's algorithm, but there is something strange about this podcast. I mean, look, he's running a really famous podcast. I truly respect his whatever he's doing. I have nothing against the guy, not at all. And I don't watch his podcast. I watched in the past 1 or 2 podcasts, but every time I log into my YouTube account, his videos pop up usually, even if it's not in the feed of the timeline. Then it comes in the suggestion videos or the automatic, because there is a shuffling, or next videos start playing, and his videos always come. It seems like there is a discussion nowadays on X, people asking each other if Lex Fridman's podcast is actually pushed by the algorithm of YouTube deliberately so that he generates more views. But this week, because he hosted Norman Finkelstein and what the so-called Destiny, I was disgusted when I watched this video. I'm going to show you just 2 segments from this discussion. I'm going to comment on them. So he says, watch the full debate, quote unquote, between Norman Finkelstein, Maureen Rabbani, Benny Morris, and Destiny. And as I expected, it was total waste of time. Aside from Norman and Maureen's parts, Morris is a deranged Zionist propagandist just spouting slogans, and Destiny just spouts Wikipedia. Take a look.
Mr. Bennell, don't change the subject. If you don't know what you're talking about, at least have the humility. You talk about chapter 6. You don't know chapter 6.
Has 242
You don't
gotten
know
to the
chapter
Palestinians
6
peace?
from tweet 5. You have no idea what you're talking about. It's just so embarrassing. At least have some humility. Between us, we've read maybe 10,000 books on the topic, and you've read 2 Wikipedia entries, and you start talking about chapter 6. Do you know what chapter 7 is?
Answer me.
You know-
Special intent. Did you read the case?
Yeah.
It is
Mr.
a highly
Farrelly,
special intent.
I'm
to be
going to
convicted
ask you
of
again.
genocide. Yes.
Please stop displaying your imbecility.
Okay, I'm sorry if you think the declaration of the judge is imbecile.
Don't put on public display that you're a moron. At least have the self-possession to shut up. Did I read the... Mr. Bennell, don't change the subject. If you don't know...
So there were other segments as well, and this is very embarrassing in my opinion, because first of all, why would you bring Norman Finkelstein and this guy together, right? And I tried to think about it, and I came to this conclusion. I wanted to share it with you. Let's just zoom in a little bit. I said, I can't figure out why I always come across Lex Fridman's clips whenever I log into my YouTube account. Lex is definitely running a popular podcast, but I'm not a fan of his style, and I rarely click on his videos. However, I watched some clips on X from the quote heated debate between Norman Finkelstein and Destiny, and I think it was horrible. I have my own YouTube channel where I host guests, so I must be familiar with their backgrounds. Bringing Norman and Destiny together on my podcast indicates that my main goal is to entertain the audience rather than educate them about Palestine. I do not invite a respected professor and renowned expert on Gaza and a moron to my show unless I want to cause social media backlash and generate views. Norman Finkelstein is not an entertaining monkey I invite to my show and let him sit in front of a moron to insult his intelligence and eventually provoke him. Podcasts must serve as a source of education in the current toxic political climate. Let's not undermine the essence of podcasts by succumbing to opportunism, ego, and greed. And you see later, he published even a segment of this fight between them. Norman Finkelstein calls Destiny a fantastic moron. Lex Fridman podcast. This gives you the impression and also the indication, what is his goal, right? Views, backlash, social media, more people know now about his podcast. I was really disgusted. Why would you humiliate even Norman Finkelstein? He should have someone is helping him with these things before he goes to some other podcasts. And unfortunately, this is a really this is the important case. You cannot put Norman Finkelstein and as an entertainment subject on a podcast. He's a respected professor. Myself, when I disagreed with him on the Syrian case, you cannot really disrespect this guy, man. He's a renowned scholar about the case, whether you agree with him or not, right? guys, this is becoming the business of podcasts, political analysis, commentaries is also becoming more populistic, because the people who are behind podcasts like this, like I'm doing a podcast, right? But I want to give you information, but I want to make it a little bit entertaining so that it doesn't get boring for you too. Because it's a 1 hour segment. Who would sit in front of a TV nowadays or in front of his phone or the laptop for 1 hour? People are looking for reels, very quick things, right? But this is also changing because of what people want to see, right? So big podcasts are trying to also change and try to behave in a way that fits this algorithm and what the people want to see. I do not want to do that. I mean, I can also go to podcasts and yell and shout and curse and smear and give middle fingers and host someone that I disagree with and try to embarrass him and do these things. This is not the purpose of my channel. I hope that you like that, because I really don't want to go slip into this go into this hole, like it's dark place in my opinion, because political discussion has to be quiet, has to be calm. We have to encourage discussion. I recently encountered a Syrian Armenian person who is also political. He studied political science and he disagrees with me on X multiple times. And I said, how about you come to my show and we discuss or we debate? And he agreed. So I sent him today an invitation for next Monday. Let's see if he is going to accept my invitation. But I'm not going to prove that I'm correct. I'm going to host him, listen to him till the end, and then disagree with him or say what I think about the case, because I want to enrich the discussion. I want for the people to listen to both sides of the story. That's the purpose of this channel, guys. If you appreciate my work, please hit the like button before you leave this live streaming. Also, leave a comment in below about your questions. If you have a questions, guys, for me to ask to Alistair Crook, who is going to be my guest on Thursday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 12 noon time in Eastern American Time. It's in 7 p.m. in Moscow time. Please drop your questions in the description. He is a former British diplomat and also former MI6 agent. We're going to discuss, of course, what's happening in Ukraine, in Palestine, in the Middle East, etc. So I would really appreciate it if you post your questions. I will definitely ask some of your questions to him. And also, if you want to support an independent journalistic work like I'm doing, because I don't have any sponsors except you can become, guys, a patron. You can see the link is scrolling now on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 12 noon time in Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.